My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here, and it's a great honor to, it's a particular honor to be introducing this event today. It's a big day for us here at Stimson for a number of reasons. You saw this book out front. First among those reasons is Ponzio has been talking about this for so long that finally we could just get it off our plate. And so that is the most exciting reason to be here. No, I jest, but this does represent a significant body of work that Richard and his colleagues, whom you will be hearing from in just a few minutes, have been invested in for so long. It also is, in my estimation, and while I am paid to say this, it also happens to be true, I think a pretty brilliant exposition of how humankind, challenged by such a broad array of transnational issues, can achieve ends that both contribute to our collective security as well as to our sense of justice. That it is, I think, upon reading it, and I hope you will agree, that it gives a very clear message that this is not necessarily a zero-sum game, right? We do not have to trade one for the other, but we can find solutions that treat these not as competing priorities, but as a holistic whole. That said, it is extremely complicated as well. I think it's ironic that the same factors that are driving us together in so many new and innovative and unanticipated ways, from technology and so many of the other forces that are not only connecting us but lifting literally millions out of the grinding poverty associated with living on $1.25 or whatever the figure is today on a daily basis. But those same forces are also yielding complex new challenges, again, that we really did not, we could not have anticipated, from cyber warfare to climate change and so forth. Meanwhile, and quite sadly, the global institutions that we created following the Second World War to manage many of these transnational and growing challenges are themselves, I think quite paradoxically, while they are growing in importance, they are losing the political support in many ways among many of their most wealthy and influential members. And it's that irony, I think, that is so well captured in this volume that I hope you will collect as you leave here today. It's certainly the subset of issues that my colleagues Richard Ponzio, William Dirch, and Joris Lark have, again, you'll be hearing from all three of them here this afternoon, have spent so much of their own careers trying to shed light on, and I think encapsulate so well in this volume. They ask in this volume how, therefore, a properly mandated, managed, and modernized global architecture of institutions and solutions can offer solutions to many of these vexing transnational challenges that we face. I also think that this volume is in many ways a demonstration of what this organization, and again I'm paid to say this, but it also is true, what this organization does better, I think, than any other entity in this town. Stimson was created 30 years ago, not just to admire the big problems and to talk about them and to write interesting papers, but to actually get our hands dirty and to do something about it, to work hand in glove with all of the constituent factors and entities and constituencies that really have to go into solving some of the biggest challenge we face as a people today. And in that regard, we are especially proud of not just this team, but the broader Just Security 2020 program. It will be featured, I should mention, if I may brag, Richard, for a moment, at next month's Paris Peace Forum. And it is working quite tirelessly to implement the discrete 85 recommendations that were generated by the Albright-Gambari Commission. I suspect you will mention that, Richard, in some of your comments as well. And I think most significantly, they are working, again, tirelessly to build that broad coalition, right? This is not just about government responses. This is not just about responses of international organizations. It really is a whole of society approach. It's NGOs, it's private industry. How do we collectively come up with solutions to grand challenges that are in all of our best interest? And so Richard, Bill, Joris, I want to congratulate you on this effort. I should also mention that they are fresh off of their New York debut just yesterday, where the permanent missions of Japan, Qatar, Nigeria, the European Union, and others launched this volume to the New York audience. Just in closing, let me also say this, that this is, of course, necessarily not just a Stimson effort. It is a truly global effort, and no one region, no one organization, no one country has a monopoly on innovation in the global governance arena. And this December, in connection with Qatar's annual Doha Forum meeting, we're pleased to be collaborating with the Doha Institute on the first of a series of global policy dialogues, that particular one focusing on preventive action and sustaining peace in the global governance space. And we're very grateful to our partners, the Qatari government, who has invited us to Doha to help organize and launch that important discussion. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Hamad Al-Mufta, who is the newest member, I think, of the U.S. of the diplomatic corps here in Washington. He has just arrived this past month as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Qatar. He still has that new car smell about him, who is going to share some remarks on his government's thinking in this wider space. He'll talk a little bit, I suspect, about the forthcoming Doha Forum and the Just Security 2020 agenda following. I should also mention, unfortunately, that Dr. Hamad has another obligation that he is going to have to literally run out the door to when he finishes remarks, and so he'll have a couple of minutes, but following his remarks, we are going to turn the dais over to a face that I suspect is somewhat familiar to you all. Heather Hurlbert, as you, I suspect, are aware, directs the New Models of Policy Change project at another think tank here in town, the New America Foundation. Nobody's perfect, Heather, but we are very grateful to you for stepping in and helping to moderate this discussion this afternoon. And with that, Dr. Hamad, welcome to Washington, welcome to Stimson, and I give you the dais, sir. I'm going to give you this as well, if I may.
Well, thank you, Finley. I would say I'm new to Washington. It's my first month in Washington, and this is my first think tank engagement. So I'm glad that I'm here in Stimson. So I can't add much to what Finley said about the book, but allow me to read my speech. We diplomats, we love speech, like reading, unlike academic. So allow me to read my short and non-boring speech. So, Mr. Finley, Ms. Hurlbert, and speakers in today's program, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues and I from the Embassy of Qatar here in DC are delighted to contribute to today's discussion and celebration of the new Stimson publication, Just Security in an Undergoverned World. So by the way, I just finished my first chapter. Restoring better balance between principles and justice and security in global governance, or Just Security, as presented in the new Stimson Center companion volume to the Albright-Gambari Commission report, is an ideal with practical dimension that Qatar remains fairly dedicated to achieving. Whether it takes the form of international assistance for refugees, children, and other vulnerable populations, or ensuring a thriving global ecosystem for future generations that confronts the challenges laid out in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. My colleagues and I are particularly pleased to see the new book's deep analysis, in addition to the recommendation for further innovating and renovating the United Nations system, in the run-up to the UN 75th anniversary, learning from other important milestones such as the UN's 50th and 60th anniversaries. We must together seize the opportunity to welcome the best and most creative ideas. Building on the UN Secretary General's current wave of reforms to further modernize the world body and prepare it for its next 75 years, special attention should be given to improving the effectiveness of Security Council, better equipping the UN development system to directly support countries in implementing their 2030 agenda's commitments, and creating further space for improving civil society, business community engagements in the UN agenda, all issues addressed skillfully by several of the authors in this new volume that will anchor our dialogues this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by noting that Qatar is delighted to partner with the Stimson Center on its Just Security 2020 program, designed to advance many of the best and timeless recommendations from the Albright-Gambari Commissions on global security, justice, and governance. Together, we look forward to taking this important conversation forward with colleagues and partners from many governments, the Secretary General and his colleagues across the UN systems, the private sector, and the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian and Dr. Al-Mufta, for summarizing and opening up the conversation we're about to have. As someone who used to have to write those speeches to be written at these kinds of occasions, that was very helpful and took away several of the things I was going to say. So I will launch in by saying how delighted I was to be asked to moderate this. As outside the world, for those of us who sadly don't sit here at Stimson and have to spend our days in the more general debate about the future of international affairs, we spend a lot of our time at the moment in a painful but also rather sterile debate about the health of the liberal order. And in the mass media, and even to a rather large extent in the foreign affairs media, you now have sort of either the liberal international order, within which the UN is subsumed, is a wonderful thing that was created by the US and the West and is now dying, or it's a set of terrible things that were created by the US and the West and is now dying. And somehow we've wound up with a public debate that completely overlooks the extent to which the UN system, the norms around it, and the web of both public and private sector cooperation around it is as healthy and diverse as it's ever been. It is generating its own norms and future and supporters, and is generating a huge, enormous, frankly rather heavy to carry around in your backpack, set of ideas about how to remedy the things that are also not going so well. So this book, although it represents, I know, years of hard labor by three of the gentlemen on this panel and many others as well, could hardly be more timely in terms of challenging all of us, both in the UN community and in broader communities, to think again about solutions to problems that we all know that we face. The format that we're going to follow here is that the three editors are going to present to you for about 15 or 20 minutes the main themes of the book. And then we're going to hear a commentary, perhaps a critique, from Dr. Amitabh Acharya, who is the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance at the School of American Studies at American University, has recently finished a tour as head of the International Studies Organization, for which I think we should all congratulate him.
Academic.
And who I think his most recent two books speak really interestingly to some of the dimensions of the challenge we face, as one is Constructing Global Order, and the other is The End of American World Order. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how both of those themes play out here. Probably our three authors need very little introduction to you, but I might have some fun introducing them anyway. Bill Dirch, of course, is no stranger to anyone in this room. Stimson would hardly be Stimson without him. And I thought rather than even try to summarize his decades of leadership in and out of government and with the UN and in the academy, writing and prodding and leading on these issues, I just mentioned that 40 years ago, Bill Dirch put out a paper about international cooperation and the effort to negotiate an international seabed resources agency. So Bill has really been at this in not just the trenches, but the undersea trenches for 40 years. Joris Larik can't boast of 40 years in the field yet, but he's making up for lost time as fast as he can. And he is on faculty at the University of Leiden and is also a much honored and awarded researcher on a wide range of international legal and security topics, looking in an interdisciplinary way that's very dear to my heart at the nexus of security issues and global governance issues, in a way that really has broken some new ground for how European researchers think about these issues. He's also probably taught more people about these issues than anyone in this room, including Bill over his career, because he was the convener of a massive online course in which 20,000 people took his class, which I think is a rather on Europe and global governance, which is a rather amazing achievement.
Who did the grading?
And last but absolutely not least, and in many ways the reason we're all here at this point, the person who just would not let this idea go, in the best possible way, Richard Ponzio, who runs the Just Security 2020 initiative here at Stimson, is responsible for all of the forthcoming activities you heard about from Brian, was the director of the original Albright-Gambari effort, and I think without whose sheer doggedness this volume would never have seen the light of day, as well as many other achievements in both the US and the UN systems working on conflict prevention and resolution. So, gentlemen, take it away.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Dr. Al-Mufta, Brian, for your very kind introductory remarks. Professor Acharya, for hopefully what will be kind remarks as our discussant later this evening. But it's truly an honor and a delight for us to have each of you as special part of this program, the chance for my colleagues, Bill, Joris, myself, to share with all of you some of the ideas and certainly recommendations coming out of this new volume, Just Security in an Undergoverned World. As we've heard today, it's the companion volume to a report that we've discussed in similar settings in the past here at Stimson and with many international partners, the Albright-Gambari Commission, its recommendations to advance a conversation between now and 2020, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, on the future of global governance. So certainly the UN's important, but we deal with many other themes as we will discuss in connection with today's book. Two other notes about our program for activities of engagement. You heard about the upcoming Global Policy Dialogue in Doha. We'll come back to Stimson in the late spring next year, and a meeting on climate governance issues at the end of the year with our partners from the Environmental Security Program, led by Sally Yozel here at Stimson. We're also pleased to announce in connection with the Paris Peace Forum that Brian mentioned, coming up on Armistice Day, the 11th of November, we unveil the successor to the Commission's website that many of you might have seen in recent years. The Commission now becoming the platform on global security, justice, and governance reform. It's a whole new suite of knowledge resources that we hope you'll find of interest and use in the coalition building, the activities to advance this conversation, which really is at the heart of our program here at Stimson. If we can turn to the next slide, before we get into our own definition, the conceptualization indeed of just security, it may be helpful to see how security is being discussed up the road in our discussions yesterday inside the New York bubble. Here's a definition, or a quote really, from Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And these terms you've seen for many decades now, human security, a great mentor of mine, Mabubul Haq, coined it in the 1993 and 1994 Human Development Reports, and linking to the global security agenda find ourselves in today. The inextricable linkages between human security, national security, global security are identified here. And building on Mahbub al-Haq's definition in the next slide on our 3 levels of security, we note that it goes at the heart of how Dr. Haq described human security as people exercising their human development choices safely and freely. And this was built upon further by Amartya Sen and Sadako Agata in the Commission on Human Security report of 2003. Over the past 2 decades, human security has arguably had a profound effect on thinking and practice related to what is often described as the conflict security development nexus in global governance. And its advocates have stressed the importance of striking a better balance between human and national state security to achieve a more holistic understanding of global security, concerned not only with the avoidance of war between states, but the avoidance of problems in our global economy and, of course, our global ecosystem today. So the next slide articulates a just security as a possible overarching and integrative vision for our multilateral system of governance. And we define it as when you're achieving it, you are forging a mutually supportive network of good democratic governance and sustainable peace globally, stressing the interdependence and indeed the interplay and the equality of these 2 fundamental concepts, justice and security. In at least 3 ways, we view just security as extending the human security approach in global governance. First, by infusing and striking a balance with core principles of justice, such as fairness and equality before the law. Second, security enhances justice by creating stable conditions in which justice can take root and flourish, as evidenced by the role of peacekeepers, for example, interposing themselves between combatants. And finally, justice reinforces security by addressing many of the root causes of insecurity at different levels of governance. So the competition for scarce resources in society, or the struggle between different societal groups who feel that they're being unequally treated. These are usually the drivers of conflict in today's world. So to elaborate further then on our conceptual framework for the project, I turn things over to my colleague, Bill Dirge.
Thank you, Richard. If we could zoom on the graphics on the screen, I would appreciate it. We'll have graphics for the next 3 slides. We depict the idea of multi-level formal and informal governance in this first graphic. In the book, governance means steering social systems toward their goals. Now, the mechanism doing the steering may be public and political, like a government, could be private and commercial, like contract arbitration, or social and amorphous, like culture and morality. They need only be regarded as authoritative and legitimate, that is, accepted as right by those being steered. Government at different levels, from national to province to city, which we show in the chart, affects people's lives, but rarely is its reach all-encompassing. The other institutions also guide and enhance or limit people's options and opportunities, and we show those in the governance band in the chart. And some fraction of human experience should or should remain ungoverned. Our private thoughts, hopes, fears, our ability to love and to be loved. The relative proportion of human experience that's covered by government or governance varies, of course, by political order. This chart depicts these relationships within a single state. The next chart depicts them across the international, or actually the global system go. Right? So this slide depicts 3 states and their civil society organizations against the pervasive background of global business. National governments work through alliances and intergovernmental organizations, the center rectangle, to attain global goals, while their provinces, regions, and cities develop global networks and coalitions with their peers, sharing solutions to common problems and mobilizing to influence solutions to global problems with local impacts, from energy to migration to climate. And this is represented by the box at the lower left. Civil society organizations also network globally, box at the upper right, on similar issues of common concern and work to influence national and global policymaking. Thousands of civil society organizations showed up, for example, at the annual conferences of the parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change at the UN. Global business doesn't need to network quite so much because companies with sufficient resources can just extend their influence to new places, often with deeper experience and knowledge base than the governments there. But business is really bad at producing global public goods. Things like a viable global climate that any entity can enjoy without diminishing its availability to others, and that no one can be practically excluded from enjoying. There's no profit in providing a good on which others can free ride, nor is there sufficient national interest in most cases to provide such goods globally. But nations will comply with global agreements creating global public goods if they see others consistently doing so. And the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting materials is a prime example of that. Next slide. Okay, so global governance institutions address political, economic, and increasingly environmental matters. As representative issues in each area, we focused on state fragility and conflict, the hyperconnected global economy, and the impact of climate change on people, especially those most vulnerable to that change. In the middle of this chart, these issue areas are depicted as overlapping triangles. Conflict and economic spaces overlap because war is destructive not only of people but economies, and not just locally but regionally. Some drivers of the global economy, especially energy resource production and use, can in turn drive climate change, which reciprocates by damaging economic productivity. Economic damage can drive people off the land and into cities, sparking conflict. So we kind of come full circle. Surrounding the issue spaces are the most closely associated international organizations with those issues. So for politics and security, it's kind of toward the upper left there, the UN Security Council, the International Criminal Court, Peacebuilding Support Office at the UN, human rights, and so forth. Upper left, international finance, economics, and trade, World Bank, the IMF, the G20, others. The bottom, climate. The outermost ring depicts the treaties and other agreements that define the responsibilities of those institutions and codify the associated international norms. So there's the global system for you to contemplate. So we editors, the commissioners, and the chapter authors had a number of ideas for dealing with the problems in these interconnected issue areas and the institutions that have an impact on them within the framing of just security. And for a sampling of those ideas, I turn the mic over to Professor Larick.
Okay, thank you very much. So based on this conceptual framework and these different levels of analysis, issue areas, I'd like to give you three examples, one from each area. There's many more in much greater detail, of course, in the book's 19 chapters. So with our special discount today, it's less than $2 per chapter that you'll get. And if you're pressed for time, there's also, of course, the Commission report, which has a list of all recommendations. And I'll also recommend the concluding chapter of the book because it paints a broader picture of the current state of global governance. So together, these recommendations form a far-reaching, but we would argue feasible way forward for global governance, also with a specific view on the upcoming UN Summit 2020. And especially today, we're well aware of the political realities, and that you hear from certain politicians sometimes now global governance, it's used as a sort of dirty word. Or is misconstrued as an abstract cosmopolitan utopia. We try to be as pragmatic as possible in this book, just accepting interdependence as a reality, and hence multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism as a necessity, and this quest for forging a mutually supportive relationship between issues of international justice and security as an inevitability if you want to move forward with sustainable peace and prosperity. So, firstly, for the area of fragility and conflict, the book calls for a peace-building audit to be added to the toolbox of the Peace-Building Commission as a tool for early warning and early action. And that proposal is elaborated on by our contributors, Professor Neshla Chirgi and Cedric de Koning. And the idea of that is to take a leaf from the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review, and apply that to conflict prevention. As a reporting mechanism, enable the PBC to work out an agreement on the signs and factors associated with possible mass atrocity events, and also to link or to feed into the analyses of structural conflict prevention issues like the Sustainable Development Agenda. So to combine or to just take into account the fact that for long-term conflict prevention you need to think you need to take the development dimension into account as well. And at the same time, to counter structural violence, you need to, of course, take conflict prevention in the short term into account as well. So you have to create kind of the base conditions for sustainable development. So we do acknowledge also in the book throughout the chapters that when we say justice and security, it doesn't mean you have to do everything all at the same time, but you have to take it into account. You can't just let's say create a secure environment and then leave it there, I think, as it often happens, but have a plan on how to also make it just and hence durable and resilient. On the area, so that would be one of the examples that we'd put at the intersection. So it's something both at the intersection of security and justice, but also thematically something at actually the intersection of all three areas here. So climate is also something that you should take into account. If you look at the latest IPCC report, something that will contribute also to escalating conflicts. So hence it really sits at the center of everything as a proposal. From the area of the hyper-connected global economy, I'd like to showcase actually a proposal by one of our youngest, the youngest contributor to the book. We also have former Undersecretaries General of Economic and Social Affairs in the book, but we thought that was really an idea that resonated strongly with us as well. Jalon Lang just started his PhD at Fletcher on curbing illicit financial flows. So it's not necessarily about raising taxes, but actually collecting them properly, making sure they're not being evaded, and not just in the global north, but especially in the global south. So he calls, among other things, for more countries to adopt the automatic exchange of information standard, spearheaded by the OECD and G20, for more countries to sign and ratify the multilateral competent authority agreement, but also more than that, not just to implement them, but also to make them fully reciprocal. So not as a way for Western countries to suck information out of global South countries, but also help global South countries have more resources, or the resources due to them are being made available. And in that sense, he also calls for more assistance that is needed in developing countries to facilitate implementation. This sits also for us at the intersection with fragility of conflict, because it doesn't just make resources available, it also counters money laundering and hence also nefarious kind of purposes that are being pursued in that way. So it's also, it's on the one hand a basic form of economic justice, but also a way of making resources available, to the benefit of making countries more resilient, secure. Actually, you could even move it also into the very center here, but that was already occupied on the slide, because that money you could also, of course, you could invest that into climate adaptation. Last but not least, from the basket of climate and people, we have I'd like to showcase the proposal for a green climate technology licensing facility, elaborated upon by Dr. Menno van der Veen, which would be in addition to the already existing framework of the still very new framework of the Green Climate Fund and its technology facility. But it's the idea to overcome a debate that you might be familiar with in the area of intellectual property rights, generic medicines, and so forth, but that will also that also applies in the area of environmentally sound technologies. So it's a debate that tends to go around in circles. Do you protect property right owners, or do you go by the utility of these kinds of measures? So he has a specific proposal on how to overcome that, and I think it's a very timely proposal, because I think if you implement that, you actually do that before, again, in view of the monumental challenge of climate change, this contributes to escalating human, national, and global security concerns. So what he proposes specifically is this technology licensing facility, which would manage environmentally sound technologies, but make royalties available to the inventors, to those. So it would stimulate innovation, but at the same time also take into account the actual utility use in developing countries. And again, similar also to Jadon's chapter, it's about some more technical assistance, making developing countries enhancing their absorptive capacities to actually do something with that technology in the quest for. To clarify, the largest shape was human experience. So I think that's also an important point to make. I think in looking at the title of the book, Undergoverned World. So we're not on some quest to regulate everything and everybody. I think, as Bill pointed out, state or non-state actors that exercise regulatory powers should also stay away from that. I think that's an important part of justice and security as well, that you don't have a state or other actors encroaching on your privacy and other fundamental rights. So I think that's the way to look at it. Yeah, in terms of the UN Charter's commitment to, it's the U.S. Constitution with "We the People," and then in San Francisco they added the S, and "We the Peoples." So that gives also a sense that it's a bit a federal idea as well, so that you have to get democratic accountability both for the individual but also for certain units with their own identity. I think that's something we've seen in federal countries like the U.S., in entities like the European Union, and then definitely also at the UN level. So it doesn't necessarily. I think there's something to be said for not going, let's say, radically democratic in terms of one person, one vote in the world, because then you have a gigantic issue of what you call the counter-majoritarian difficulty, because if you're not part of that majority, you're then you'll be on the losing side of global governance, I think. But certainly that balance needs a lot more updating and fine-tuning than is the case currently. Yeah.
And you referred to the chapter by Zhedan Lang on illicit financial flows. We all know about tax evasion, and Professor Acharya talked about fairness in our tax codes in the West, but it's in the developing world that is identified as the most important issue for the resources that are necessary for this Agenda 2030. That's where the biggest gap is. The second example, though, another chapter by Dr. Volker Lehmann from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung on the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, a very important innovation in global governance, role of civil society as watchdog organizations, putting a light on the tremendous wealth that are in many developing countries. Where are these mineral resources going? The coffers of multinationals, are they going to the government? How's that money being spent? We have many ideas on an EITI Part 2 and taking it further, of course, that's what scholars do, but at the same time, nobody should dismiss the important advances we've seen just in a few short years there, and the Kimberley process on blood diamonds, et cetera. So a lot of justice can be addressed, as you said, in the commercial sector with these new types of innovations in global governance.
Great. The gentleman over here, please.
Yes.
Hang on, just please wait for the mic.
Microphone. Thanks. I'm Richard Cronin. I'm a fellow at the Stimson Center. I was wondering about to take it in a different direction in terms of real situation. So the question of, for instance, could we have a liberal order without a hegemon, that being the U.S.? And I'm thinking about that, and particularly in the connection of what now we see the rising powers, a kind of replay perhaps of the 19th century, in the sense that, take two examples, Russia and Ukraine, or the South China Sea, China and the South China Sea. So in the latter, actually UNCLOS, UN Conventional Law of the Sea Tribunal, ruled against China on their attempt to declare sovereignty over other countries, massive parts of other countries. They're 200 mile exclusive economic zones. Okay, and they're doing what they please. And in Russia and Ukraine, it seems that maybe the thing wasn't so much a hegemon, but during the area of polarity, bipolarity, things didn't happen so much at the borders of the two spheres of influence, because it would lead to complications between the two powers. And so I'm trying to figure out where in your framework these actual real world situations might fit.
Yes, I'd definitely like to hear from you on this as well.
My answer to your question is yes, you can have a liberal order without a hegemon. That's for multiple reasons. First of all, there was never really a global liberal order. Liberal order was hyped, but it was always international order with basically among the Western countries. As Joe Nye and I agree when he reviewed my book, that it was always like a club of the West. China and India were never part of the liberal global order. Most of the developing world was not part. They were not aligned. The biggest democracy in the world was an ally of the Soviet Union. So I have to understand there are myths about the liberal order. I have a chapter on the myths of liberal order. But having said that, The liberal order does have multiple constituencies. It was not built only by the United States. My colleague Miles Kaler argues the Western European countries played a monumental contribution to the liberal order and still do. If you look at the covenants, for example, of human rights, there were a lot of African countries and post-colonial countries contributed to human rights covenant. They might have abused it, but they were, building it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Charles Malik of Lebanon and the nationalist China's foreign minister played a very important role. So the liberal order has a lot of constituencies, and they come forward if you get away from this narrative that somehow it was only built by the United States. It never was, really. And the third thing I would say, we don't know the answer. Because at this time, give me 2 years or 6 years, I can tell you. Because as long as we have a leader of the liberal order who is actively undermining every pillar of the liberal order, we don't know the answer to that. So I have a feeling that if Hillary Clinton owned the presidency, we will be talking about the end of the liberal order. So as long as we have a phenomenon here which is undermining free trade, international institutions, supporting populist movements, I think I can't tell you the answer to that. But I do believe that the liberal order will continue. It will never become a hegemonic global order, but there are elements of liberal order which are too deeply ingrained and universal.
Yours.
Yeah, no, I'd like to add a few points to that, and I think it speaks also to Professor Acharya's point about it won't just disappear overnight. These institutions are there, these norms, and they are being used. And I think it's always a mix probably of a bit of idealism and probably a lot of self-interest as well. But I think as long as there's actors that see value and can use these kinds of institutions for their own benefit, even if they accept that they lose sometimes, I think we're fairly safe, at least in terms of not seeing a complete collapse soon. And so the examples that you've mentioned, I think, speak to that as well. With the South China Sea arbitration in The Hague, China didn't show up, but it didn't withdraw from UNCLOS either. It's still a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. You could even say it engaged remotely with the proceedings, with these government position papers. It still argues within the framework of international law, and also Russia-Ukraine, I think, is a good example of that. I just from another workshop in The Hague the other day, I heard some fascinating stories from investment lawyers. So Russia there's still bilateral investment treaties between Ukraine and Russia and others, and Ukrainian companies have now started to sue Russia over that. Say, okay, for companies based in Crimea. And saying, well, this is Russia now, so this is a foreign investment, so we'll drag you in front of an arbitrator. And Russia plays along with that. It's okay, maybe just in terms of the general investment climate, they play along and now have to pretend that it's not Russia. So situations like that, because that's the two examples that you mentioned, I think many actors, small and larger, see value in these institutions. As long as they do, they won't collapse.
Maybe one brief addition, and that is, if you go back to the Cold War and the defense of the liberal order against the Soviet Union and Communist China at the time, I don't think that would have been possible without the United States. The size and power of the U.S. behind and market, right? I think it would have been overrun. So I think you can juxtapose that, and then if you took the U.S. out of that, boom. Now the threats are a little bit more amorphous. They're mostly market. Now they're cyber, which is much more insidious, and it's not an area where we really have learned yet how to erect defenses that really work, because the turnaround time on defense-offense, the cycle is so fast. It's like the next kid with a good idea. And so I think the jury may be a little bit out, but I think I would be a little more pessimistic. That if the U.S. were merely neutral at this point, if we were merely neutral, it'd be fine. Right? If we disappeared, I think it would collapse.
We will take our last question over here. Thanks. The mic is coming behind you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fantastic. I look forward to reading my tome. I'll carry it home tonight. And thanks for the discount per chapter. Mine's a little bit of a comment that I'd like to ask the panelists to reflect on. I work for the UN. I've worked for the UN for over 20 plus years now, unfortunately 22. The UN is not the unfortunate bit, but the years are. And I want to put to you the question of liberal world order. I hear a lot of equation of the liberal world order with the UN, and wanted to posit that my experience is not that. And I want to posit also the power, I hate to say this, but the power of the lowest common denominator. It can be so beautiful when it works. The UN did development work. I work for the development program. We did development work on the ground before the Cold War and after the Cold War when it was over. And our programs are approved by a body of, for instance, in our case, 56 member states. The General Assembly is, of course, all the member states. And the power of that common denominator, the work that we do in Laos, we were talking about, or in Syria in the times before, were actually things that both the US government, China, Russia, all of them agreed to as by virtue of being on our executive board, and we proceeded with those things. All this discussion on human security, human development, all of that, it came out of that consensus actually, and it's not even consensus, it's the lowest common denominator. And that was very powerful. And I wanted to just sort of posit to the panelists, there is a distinction, and sometimes our strength is actually not being the liberal world order. It is actually being that thing that all of you guys can agree on, and we'll just go do it on the ground. The challenge is how do we expand that space that we can actually stop the conflict? How do we expand that space, not of global governance per se, but the space in which we can actually be deployed by the guys in the P5, P8, P28, whatever it will be, so that we can go ahead and help with violence prevention or preventing conflict, etc. I just felt strongly about this, wanted to share. Thank you.
So I wonder if you'd each like to use that as a jumping off place for some final thoughts about where global governance situates itself in this multipolar post-hegemonic moment.
I'm not sure I have anything brilliant to say to conclude, but we are at a very critical, maybe not a moment, but a period in managing global problems, right? I mean, we can talk about liberal, illiberal. We can talk about traditional military issues and balances and polarities and so forth. But the issue that is and will continue to be gaining on us faster and faster is climate change, is the impact of our own economies on global planetary systems, not just climate, but all the other 9 to 12 systems that are approaching what scientists call planetary boundaries. You exceed those, you're done. You're just done. And climate and ocean acidification have begun to creep into, right now, into the kind of the amber zone, if you look at their charts. And the predictions increasingly are they're going to head toward the red zone. If you're in the red zone, you've pretty much lost the ability to control it. So that's what we need to really get our heads around and try to do it in a way that respects human rights, respects the various orders we're used to. You look at China, and they are a major contributor to global warming, yes, but they're also making very strong steps toward reversing that problem, controlling it, and they're doing it in a much more efficient fashion than we are right now with our nativist debates and concerns about migration. They don't have those things because people disagree. They put them in the gulag or they kill them. But they're very efficient, okay? And if it comes down to efficiency, then the liberal order is in big trouble. So we should pretty much figure out how to pull our socks up and make it work within our order. So I'll stop there. But that's an urgent problem that really doesn't care what the shape of the order is because the planet doesn't really care. And we should take some steps to act in our own best interest.
Just one thing I'll say briefly about that is, so we heard already that when we say about liberal world order, it wasn't really global, or at least its origin wasn't. But maybe to add to that, think we also have to look at an expanding or changing notion of what liberal means. And I think it already means different things in different countries. So when in Europe, actually, we still think of this as kind of 19th century liberalism, laissez-faire, just don't do things. So the lowest common denominator, that might just mean back off, don't do anything. So as long as you comply with certain duties of abstention, it's fine. Don't torture, don't violate certain rights, and you're fine. For the rest, it's everybody's individual problem. And I think why we chose also undergoverned in the title is that, well, the kind of challenges that we face, climate change being one of them, the most preeminent one, is that they require duties of action. That's a different lowest common denominator. It's okay, at least you're already at the stage where you have to do something, you have to deliver something together, and things that are harder to monitor and harder to enforce, certainly judicially. So I think I agree with most of what you said, but I think for me it evoked this sense of when we say we liberal world order, that term in itself, also the liberal element in it has changed.
Great, and I'll quickly wrap up by saying that your point is well taken, yes, and that at the very least, the UN has to remain the central meeting space of different views, different cultures, backgrounds. If we can't come together just on the critical issues of war and peace, the UN is failing at its fundamental mission. And while the points Professor Acharya mentioned that, maybe we're fooling ourselves, there's some visionary mythical notions of liberal democratic order that are going to be promulgated and safeguarded by these global institutions. It was never the case, and especially under strain today. But I would like to finish by noting that since the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the push for more connectivity through a liberalization of our economic space, that's what the WTO and getting China and Russia and others on board. Now it's the US that is the first to distance itself and use tariffs and things that go against what that whole order was about since the 90s. And secondly, while we're celebrating the 70th anniversary this year of the Human Rights Declaration, democracy in itself has been prevalent in the UN agenda since the year 2000. These are the terms that are most associated with free societies and liberal democratic order. Now, is there one form of democracy? And is the UN this place to show that there are many ways to advance progress? But open free societies have been shown to help countries with decades of conflict, even though it's messy and very difficult to implement. It is still, I think, the best course of what the UN can promote in countries that have been fractured and can work their way through. And it also, I think, is part of the solution, and at least raising the right ideas and the right analysis for the monumental issue that Bill referred to, climate change, which really touches upon everything. But I know, Professor Acharya, have a final thought.
Thank you for. I hate to be the bearer of good news, but I think the last 2 years have sort of made us pessimistic. I read a book, edited book, on Hawaii global governance. And it was an edited book, not my own work. And one of the chapters was on human security by Andrew Mack, who edits the Human Security Report. We found that actually the global governance and security has improved dramatically. The UN has been far more successful than people give credit for. But it is successful not because of the UN intergovernmental mechanism, it's because of something like this. When you have different stakeholders, and this is a very accurate characterization of what I call a multiplex world. The only thing missing is the interdependent structure. Now, global governance has been fragmenting for decades. We found 9 issue areas from immigration to internet. And the UN and the big multilaterals have stopped being the only actors in the town, only game in the town. They've been joined by a whole range of actors in every different issue area, global health to security. But some people, like my friend Tom Weiss, will be very worried about that. Wow, the big multilaterals are declining, that's bad news. Other people like me, I think fragmentation, like Schumpeter said, destruction can be creative. You can actually build new things out of this. So I would invite you to read this book called Why Govern, with 14 chapters with experts. And we actually thought that even if the liberal order is becoming something like post-liberal, it was always a bit of a myth anyway. But I don't think people are all of the sudden, unless we have a completely different world, everybody turns into a monster, and it can happen. But I think there is enough, like for example, look at China. China is accused of all sorts of things, but China is not trying to destroy the liberal order. I go to China all the time. They do not like, they never like the democratic political element of the liberal order, but they want to keep the institutions because they are a member of the Security Council. They want to have trade, although they may disagree with Trump on what is fair trade and what is free trade. India is not trying to destroy the liberal order. I don't know what will happen to Brazil. That's very different and it's coming up. But what I'm trying to say, and the nature of conflict is also changing. A lot of the conflict now is intrastate, as you would figure it out. But I think there are also new mechanisms. People had given up on climate change. They're never we're going to have an agreement. For another UN framework convention, never going to reach an agreement. We did have the Paris Agreement. So why can't we just not go beyond the news cycle? And there are a lot of pessimism out there. Then I think I just said, we're not going to go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So there is a way, and this fragmentation with multiple actors, multi-level governance is going to stay. Now, every day we have a new regional NGO being created. There was actually a study done by One Earth Future Foundation who calculated since 1900, there is a new either IGO or INGO every day this century. These things are going to do something. The states are creating it for something. Some of them do bad things, a lot of them good things. So I would like to say that let's just not be too pessimistic about it. But the long-term trends are not all that negative. And in fact, there are some very positive trends. So I think your book will start a debate on this.
Well, it's not all that often these days that you go to an event in Washington that ends on a rousing note of optimism. So
that's why I said I didn't want to bring the good news.
With that, I want to first remind you that the book is available for sale. Second, invite you to join our friends at Stimson afterwards for a lovely reception they have put on outside. And third, ask you to join me in thanking the panel for this stimulating and optimistic conversation.